Thank you, Vanessa. Bonjour. Good morning to you all. Au nom de la section de droit civil et de la section de Common Law de la Faculté de droit, il me fait extrêmement plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette grande conférence. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here on behalf of my colleague, Dean Kristen Boone of the Common Law section and myself from the Civil Law section to welcome you at the University of Ottawa for what promises to be a spectacular conference. Some of you are joining us from abroad, whether it is in this room or virtually. So thank you very much for being with us. We're glad you could cross the borders. We're grateful for your presence, for your participation, and for your contributions. As we are launching this conference on borders and boundaries, I would be remiss not to acknowledge myself, the land on which we stand today. Alors, j'aimerais aussi rendre hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de ce territoire non cédé, et les remercier de nous accueillir et de nous permettre d'avoir de belles discussions aujourd'hui sur ce territoire. I also want to take a moment to thank the organizers of the conference, my colleagues, Colleen M, always so energetic and wonderful, as well as YY Chain, Raywat Deondandan, Sam Halaby, and Sophie Thériault, as well as Giles Holland, Sophie Nanelli, and the wonderful civil law and common law students who have been involved in supporting this organization, and you'll allow me to name them, Sally, Nicole, Caroline, and Sarah. Merci à vous tous et toutes. As a legal geographer, I'm really inspired about this conference themes, borders, boundaries, and pandemics, which I believe to be of the utmost importance for scholars, practitioners, and the public alike as we pause and reflect on this pandemic. For lawyers and scholars, borders and boundaries are fruitful and productive tools and constructs. They allow us to differentiate between things, people, and practices. As David Delaney once wrote, we draw a line, we establish an inside and an outside. At this side and at that side, we assign a set of if, thens to precise location with respect to the line or to the act of crossing the line. In defining borders and setting boundaries, we use space as a powerful tool to protect and save, but also to exclude and push away, to confine, sometimes for our own sake, but also to expel and to refuse to share. The pandemic has reminded us of that power and of such consequences. As we created borders and boundaries, sometimes fixed, but often fluid, pushing the others away and staying in closely knit bubbles, we aim at protecting the most vulnerable, protecting those inside from the outside, away from the virus and imminent death. In doing so, we have saved many lives and gained some precious time in our race for the vaccines. Those on the inside, however, have in some cases suffered the consequences of confinement, from the isolation of our youth and the violence of an abusive spouse to our children's hunger. In some cases, confinement meant heightened danger and contagion, such as in prisons, shelters, and long-term care facilities, creating further vulnerabilities and inequalities. On the outside, many were exposed to even greater risks, as they did not have the privilege of staying inside, like essential workers operating the front line in places of care, in schools, in grocery stores, or food processing facilities. Others, including the homeless and the marginalized, who live and survive in public spaces, face repression and banishment as they were excluded from the outside, traced and ticketed for being in public spaces, punished for not having the luxury of a backyard or a property line in times of curfew. The pandemic has blurred the lines between protection and exclusion, between in place and out of place, challenging our understandings of borders and boundaries. In many ways, and with the use of technologies, we have removed boundaries and ignore borders, creating virtual spaces of communication and meeting, reducing physical constraints and shortening distances. Yet, we have also reinforced borders between the countries who could pay for the precious mask and protective gear and then the vaccines, and those who had to wait and die. And we have created new boundaries as some of us have developed long-term disabilities. The pandemic has revealed pre-existing vulnerabilities and injustices, but also hopefully our common humanity. And it is to that I turn in concluding my remarks today. To all of you, my fellow colleagues, I wish you a superb conference, stimulating discussions, great encounters, and several policy takeaways if possible. I hope you'll be inspired as I am and by what you'll learn the next few days. If that's the case, it will certainly be thanks to the amazing speakers in this room and virtually, and to the organizers for having put together such a fantastic program. Bonne conférence à tous et à toutes. Merci beaucoup.
I could just say what she said and sit down because that was so good. Merci beaucoup, Marie-Ève, c'est fantastique. I'm Colleen Flood. I'm one of the co-organizers with my good friends and colleagues, Sam Halaby, Sophie Thériault, Ray Deodandon, and YY Chen. So we have put this conference together. We're working on a book collection to come out of it, which will be published open access with Routledge. And so what I'm going to present to you is a little bit of an overview, both for what we think will be the beginning of the book and also for the conference today as well, and many of the similar themes that you have heard from Marie-Ève. So, So let's start with the fact that millions of people, over 6.5 million people, have died from COVID, and many more are suffering with long COVID or the effects of the COVID disease. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind all the time. And as the COVID pandemic emerged, many countries, as we know, placed restrictions on entry at their borders to buy some time to respond to the COVID pandemic, to slow or even in some cases to stop transmission. Then, in addition to those restrictions at national borders, borders were drawn within countries, between states, provinces, regions, and territories, and around, as we've discussed already, sites of extreme vulnerability, such as long-term care homes, psychiatric institutions, and prisons. Restrictions were later placed directly on individuals contingent on their vaccine status, restricting access to things such as non-essential services and to some employment. These measures were undertaken amidst the chaos and urgency of a surging pandemic, meaning that, perhaps the decisions were often not made with the usual deliberation and public consultation that we would normally expect with such big changes. So our goal with this conference is to really interrogate governments and private sectors' use of borders and boundary restrictions with a view to trying to figure out what went right, what went wrong, and how we can approach this question as we go into the future. Now, as we think about this, I think we need to remember that managing borders to stop the spread of disease is far from a new thing. The very word quarantine comes from quarantina, as many of you know, meaning 40 days, which is the period within which ships were required to remain off the coast to prevent the spread of the Black Death, the plague, right? So societies have been using border restrictions, border controls for an awfully long time. But when the COVID-19 pandemic started to emerge in January 2022, governments, as we said, were forced to take sweeping action with limited public deliberation. And it would seem that too frequently marginalized communities were overlooked, sometimes thrown under the bus. The COVID-19 pandemic, targeted in extreme ways very vulnerable groups like the residents of long-term care homes, racialized and lower income populations bore more of the burdens. So we want to interrogate the success of our pandemic response with a particular focus on marginalized and vulnerable populations. How can we protect those who are vulnerable on both sides of borders? How can we ensure the decision to close borders avoid xenophobic or racist calculations and effects? How can we manage borders as public health response to best account for the vulnerability of those impacted? Vulnerability which may stem from both a failure to act, so from the people who will die from the disease, and from the public health precautions themselves. This is a two-sided sword. How should public actors respond to and communicate the ever-shifting scientific evidence relating to the virus, vaccination and precautions, and the need for border measures while combating a tsunami of misinformation? And what role, as legal scholars, for those of us here who are, what role does law play in all of this, in framing and mediating debates over and about, for example, international law and human rights, including the right to health, mobility rights, and so on? So we sort of think about this issue of borders and boundaries as a layered one. At the international level, the first layer of bordering came in the global response in the first few critical months of the pandemic. The response was heterogeneous, with a group of countries moving swiftly in defiance of the World Health Organization recommendations at the time to impose strong border restrictions, and other countries moving more slowly, if at all. And so we're going to go into this debate as to whether those countries that moved quickly at the beginning of the pandemic and tightly managed their borders got it right. Debate is ongoing then to the extent to which the World Health Organization's international health regulations should be revisited, given how many countries acted unilaterally to restrict their borders to stop the spread of COVID-19. So that's the first layer at the international level. At the second level, drilling down to layers within regions and states, there were contests and challenges as to whether provinces or states or economic regions can close their borders to others. As most of you know, Canada's smaller eastern provinces restricted travel across their borders, which combined with other measures seems to have significantly reduced their death toll from COVID-19. For limited periods of time, there were even travel restrictions between two of Canada's largest provinces, Ontario and Quebec. And some question not only the practical realities of this, but the very constitutional permissibility of these kinds of border restrictions. So both within federations such as Canada and regional economic organizations such as the EU, concerns about public health were juxtaposed against individual claims to mobility, whether for work or personal reasons. And within those subnational units, we saw actions taken by Indigenous groups to restrict mobility to and from those lands. So international, national, and regional. Then at the local level, we saw hard border lines drawn around extreme sites of vulnerability. For example, Canadian provinces and many other jurisdictions put in place tight entry restrictions around long-term care homes, around prisons, and mental health institutions. We will discuss the impacts of these frequently very hard border measures with expert contributors from different disciplines, underscoring the extraordinary suffering inflicted upon the residents of long-term care homes, prisons, and psychiatric institutions, as well as on the homeless, both from the disease itself and from the measures. So what can we learn from these experiences so that going forward, public health restrictions do not cause unnecessary harms, and that the dignity and needs of those most impacted by hard border measures are calibrated in how the measures are implemented? And then finally, the most local layer, if you like, is at the individual level. And once COVID-19 vaccines became available, many governments implemented border restrictions requiring proof of vaccination. This was done primarily at first to prevent transmission, but then more indirectly to promote vaccine uptake so as to prevent the healthcare system being strained or overloaded. And now it seems we're teetering, some say, on collapse. Canadian provinces and many jurisdictions worldwide put in place requirements for vaccination to work in long-term care settings and required proof of vaccination to enter non-essential settings. Private and non-governmental actors too, large banks, universities, and so on, at times required proof of vaccination to work and attend on campus. So our expert panel, we have two on vaccine passports and mandates, will unpeel layers of issues relating to the changing evidence, vaccine evolution and efficacy, and the changing nature of the virus through all these variants, the spread of misinformation, and changing levels of trust and public health actors. So we have, as you see, several themes that we want to pick up on, and I'll just reiterate those before I close and pass the baton to Vanessa to introduce our first panel. So the first theme is the theme of vulnerability. And as I've mentioned already, there's vulnerability on both sides of the trade-off. Without a doubt, the majority of the 6.5 million people who have died already and those who have suffered through the pandemic have been from the most vulnerable populations. Yet on the other hand, efforts taken to manage the spread of the disease, such as through border management, can disproportionately burden those who are most vulnerable too. So how do you strike the right balance, acknowledging that there are economic and other imperatives that may dissuade governments from implementing public health measures? How can we develop global rules to ensure that public health is driving decision-making as opposed to racism and xenophobia? And can we ensure that countries and people adversely affected by travel restrictions, including migrants and refugees, are protected from the harsh consequences? So I will just go on a little tangent here to say that, I think we would acknowledge that perhaps Canada needs to improve here. And many of you, well, maybe not all of you, because some of you look a little young, but we'll recall the SARS pandemic in 2002. Canada was stung by the fact that the WHO issued a travel advisory against Toronto and Canada because of the inability of Canada to report on infection levels because federal and provincial governments would not work together. And so as a result, Canada was a strong proponent of the international health regulations promulgated in 2005 that made it more difficult to put in place travel bans. And yet in 2014, despite all of that background, Canada was one of the two countries to put in place travel restrictions on West African countries in response to the Ebola outbreak. So we have something of a complicated history, and perhaps because of that complicated history, as the COVID pandemic gathered steam, Canada was slow to put in place a border measure or border restrictions with stated concerns about human rights and racism vis-a-vis the origin of the disease in China, while other countries moved much more rapidly, like Singapore, to put in place restrictions by the end of January. So in refusing to implement those travel restrictions, Canada pointed to the international health regulations and evinced these concerns about human rights. And yet in December 2021, Canada moved quickly in the face of reports of a new Omicron variant coming out from South Africa to put 10 African countries on a no-fly list. So this raises concerns about why this and not that. And I think we need to ask those questions. This relates to another theme that we need to explore is around evidence and precaution. The question of evidence and the evidence that counts and the quality of evidence and what that needs to be relied on when placing restrictions on borders is an incredibly important question. The precautionary principle, which is so critical to public health, states that if there is a strong suspicion that a thing will substantially harm a population, then protective action should be supported before there is complete scientific proof of the risk. Early on, there was disagreement about the seriousness of the disease, with some scientists predicting a much lower global infection and fatality rate, and therefore arguing for a slowing of mitigation efforts, travel restrictions prime amongst them. So going forward, how should decision makers and jurists reviewing those decisions, because often they do wind up and courts. Approach questions of the evidence related to triggering border restrictions and reopening. Another theme that we will come to that relates to the question of evidence is what many have described as the misinformation pandemic. And my colleague Ray DeDand in this next panel will really interrogate that more. How do we respond to this as we contemplate how decision makers should open and close borders and the response by the public? If I could answer that question, I probably wouldn't be here. All right, and then the final theme is the theme of governance. This is the second to final theme is this question of rights as a trump card. And one thing that we want to interrogate is the primacy of things like civil rights, mobility rights, as opposed to a right to health, which is a different kind of right, not as valued perhaps or as protected in Canadian law as other kinds of civil liberties. So how should we think about rights as trump cards? Because throughout the pandemic, various groups, both legal and more generally, have claimed rights not to be vaccinated, not to mask, et cetera, et cetera. How should we think about those rights in the context of the numbers of people who have suffered and died and their rights, arguably, to health and to life? And then finally, this is a cartoon that came from 2002. So an aerial view of who is responsible for mishandling SARS. I think we could probably do this right now for COVID-19 as well. Many will be running for cover. We've all made mistakes through this pandemic. But how do we think about accountability here, particularly between levels of the layers of governmental decision-making, between international governance, national governance, subnational governance, provincial governance, municipal governance? How do we work together to better respond to future pandemics? So we really hope we've tried to put together a multidisciplinary group of scholars to really help wrestle with these questions. And we ourselves are a multidisciplinary group. We work at the crosshairs between law and public health and human rights and constitutional law. And we hope that you will enjoy this event and that together we can work to save lives, avoid harm, and specifically to reduce wherever possible harmful impacts on the most vulnerable. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa.